Bonjour les gars, today we are talking about a super important topic that is topology. Let's do some retopology on a super good guy who is really maybe sporty as me. I'm going to show you my process and my workflow using an awesome add-on which is free and I'm sure that you are going to love. We'll cover some basic knowledge and concept around topology along with a lot of tips for using retopo tools in Blender. So guys, let's not waste any more time. Let's go! So for today's video, as I said, we are going to use this model that we sculpt in Blender. His name is Coach and he comes from the movie Meet the Robinsons. We thought it would be really interesting to work on him and eventually create some animation in future video as well. As you can see, this is a high resolution mesh with a very high poly count, around 10 million triangles. It's really impressive to handle this kind of geometry directly in Blender, and we didn't rely on ZBrush. Instead, we pushed our entire workflow inside Blender, even for high-resolution sculpting. Blender has evolved and improved a lot over the past few years, which is really great to see. We also gather references from the movie to help us sculpt as accurately as possible, trying to match the likeness and overall shapes of the character. And we are pretty happy with the final results. So now, let's use this model for some retopology. So first, we are going to focus on the head. I'm going to hide the rest of the model and only keep the head and the eyes visible. The first thing I will do is create a plane and roughly position it around the head area, just to align the origin between both models. Before going any further, make sure to activate the Snap tool and set it to face mode. This is quite essential because it will allow us to snap all the new quads we created directly into the surface of the high poly mesh during the retopology process. After that, I will go into edit mode and delete the face of the plane. This way, I keep the object itself but remove all its geometry. It basically gives me an empty mesh to start from without any existing topology getting in the way. From there, we can start fresh and begin building everything using the PolyQuilt Addon. So PolyQuilt is a free add-on for retopology and it's really powerful and super enjoyable to use. Even though it's free, it offers many of the features you typically find in other add-ons, including paid ones. I highly recommend give it a try. We fully adapted it in our workflow at ProSprod and it works great whether you are an individual artist or working in a professional environment. You will find the link in the description if you want to test it out. So I will say, how does it work? It's really simple. By default, you have the first mode, and if you hold left click, you can see all different modes. The PolyQuilt mode itself is very straightforward. You just click once to create a quad. There you go, your first quad. Then you can select an edge, and when you reach the little arrow, you can extrude. You can also use Shift to extrude, and it's very intuitive. Holding Shift lets you quickly flip space, and by pressing A twice, you can unselect everything. What's really nice is that you have a lot of options, starting at the top, where you can choose what kind of geometry you want to draw. By default, it's set to quads, but you can also use triangles or polygons. You can also change the behavior of the brush. The default behavior is smooth. As soon as you have some quads, you can use it and better see the results. On the right-hand side, you will find the tool panel where you can get similar settings to the ones of the left, but with more options. One really important and powerful feature here is the ability to adjust your shortcut very easily. You can expand this panel to better see everything. As you can see, I've customized some shortcuts: delete without left click, dissolve loop with Ctrl plus Shift plus left click, and the edge loop tool with Ctrl plus Alt. With that last one, I can directly select and create an edge loop directly, which is really handy. Holding Ctrl also lets you add loop on spawns, similar to the native Ctrl plus R shortcut in Blender. So you can mix both workflows, which is why it's so powerful. The knife tool works just like Blender's native one. The delete tool is also really fun. By holding Alt, you can quickly delete faces. Sometimes you may need to release Alt and press it again to keep deleting. You also have the brush tool and the seam tool, which is very useful. When building your retopology, at some point, you will want to define seams, not just for UVs, but also for selection later on when rigging and skinning. Another really powerful tool is the quad patch. If I draw a line here, for example, you can see it's just a straight line, but through the settings, I can choose the level of subdivision. For example, if I set it to 6 and draw another line parallel to the first one, it automatically creates a nice patch of faces. This makes it really easy to quickly build and adjust part of your mesh. I can then switch back to a more classic edge mode, draw in parallel again, and it will automatically bridge the edge. It's very intuitive and extremely efficient. I won't go too deep into every detail because you will see it's quite easy to get used to. Everything is customizable and you can really adapt it to your workflow. The only thing to keep in mind is that symmetry can be a bit tricky, so I usually focus on one side and then apply symmetry afterwards. I can't recommend this add-on enough. It's really powerful, easy to use, and it's free. So now, let's dive into the topology of the head, starting with some basic principles and fundamentals of the face topology. Alright, so let's clear everything I did here. I just select everything and delete it, make it a bit of space, and we are good to go. I will keep an eye on my shortcut so I remember which ones I'm using. Now, I've got my hair poly mesh and my retopo setup ready, so we can start building the retopology. But before jumping in, something I really recommend is to take a moment to analyze your mesh. A great way to do that is by using the annotation tools, and I really help you to understand the overall flow of the topology you are going to build, especially on something like the head. So here, I'm creating a new annotation layer in the View tab and selecting the annotation tool. So make sure you're set to surface, so your stroke snaps directly into the mesh. I will create the first layer and set it to black. Why? Because this will represent my symmetry line. There is no native mirroring for annotation unless you go into more complex setup like textures. So I'll keep it simple. So you can start drawing with left click, hold shift, and quickly sketch a symmetry line. It doesn't have to be perfect. If you want more control, you can switch to the annotation line mode. For example, holding Ctrl while placing it in the center gives you a perfectly straight line. It's not always the most practical though, so I usually just draw something quickly and adjust it. At any point, you can press Ctrl and click Erase part of your stroke and refine it if needed. So if you want something cleaner, you can tweak it as you go. That works for me. Now let's focus on the eyes and the main facial features to better understand the topology flow we are going to build and how we are going to approach it. So now, let's start drawing the main feature of our topology. I'm going to create another layer, and here I will sketch the general flow of the topology we need. First, we need something around the eyes. Then, inside that, we will add another loop closer to the eyes itself. The second major flow is a big one that starts from here and goes all the way down to the chin. Since this is a very stylized face, it's important to understand how to adapt the topology to match those shapes. Then, of course, we will add a loop around the mouth. I'm holding Shift here to get a more stable stroke. We can also define the main line of the jaw. There isn't necessarily a strict edge loop here, but it helps to separate the main area of the face, and most of our edge loop will eventually converge around this region. So these are the basics. From there, we will start adding more edge loop spans, and the main challenge will be deciding where to change direction along these flow lines. That's where we will introduce what we call poles. So I'm going to cover poles in more details later, but for now, just to quickly understand why we need them. The goal is to achieve clean topology so we can properly animate our character. Whether the character is smiling, doing extreme expressions, or just subtle deformations, having a clean quad-based topology will give you much better and more predictable results. That's why this is so important. We are starting with the head, but of course, other parts of the body also come with challenges, like the elbows, the knees, and especially the hands. But the face is definitely the trickiest and the most important area to get right. There are some general rules you can try to follow, and there are plenty of great references online showing good topology, flows, and examples. It's always a good idea to study those. Now if I add another annotation layer, this one will represent spans. When I talk about pose, hear what I mean. Let's say you have an edge loop around the upper lip, and then you add another loop next to it. Thanks to the annotation tool, it's easy to visualize what's happening. You will have one flow going around the mouth and another one nearby. At some point, you will need to change direction, especially in areas like the cheek, where you want to add more geometry. This is where poles appear. If I draw it, it will look something like this. You have 1, 2, 3, 4, and then an extra connection point. In most cases, vertices are connected to 4 edges, which is ideal for quad topology. But when you have 5 connections at a single point, that's what we call the pole. It allows you to redirect the flow of your topology. The main key here is to place these poles carefully. You want to avoid putting them in areas with heavy deformations, like around the mouth or eyes during expressions. Instead, place them in less critical zones where we won't cause visible issues. For example, around the eyes here, you might typically have around 5 main poles, one at the top, some on the side, and others placed smartly to get the flow. Of course, you will have more poles across the entire mesh, but this is a core principle to keep in mind. Place your pole intentionally and in the right spot to maintain the clean and the efficient topology. Another key concept to keep in mind is the idea of midlines and connecting lines. On certain features, you can define clear center lines that help structure your topology. For example, adding a midline across the face helps you divide things in a clean and logical way, making things easier to organize your overall topology as you build it. The same applies to areas like the mouth. Defining central lines there helps guide your edge loop to make it easier to place additional spans. For instance, if I add 2 spans on the upper part, I will need to match that on the lower part as well. This is really important. You always want corresponding spans between the upper and lower areas, especially for the eyes and the mouth. This consistency helps a lot when rigging and animating. When deformation happens, everything behaves much more smoothly if your topology is balanced and symmetrical in terms of edge flows and density. So for example, if I draw a nice edge loop around the eye and then define loops around the mouth, I need to make sure that whatever I add on the upper side, it's also reflected on the lower side. You want everything to match as much as possible. That way, when you're doing skinning or transferring weight, it becomes much easier to manage. And again, during animation, the deformation will look much cleaner. These are the main ideas to keep in mind: connecting your spans properly, maintaining matching counts between related areas, defining strong main lines and mid lines. With that, you already have a solid foundation to start your topology. Another thing I personally like to follow is keeping an even number of edge loops, especially for circular areas like the eyes and the mouth. So for example, 2, 4, 6 loops instead of odd numbers. It just makes it easier later when you need to fill gaps or adjust topology. That's more a personal preference, but it's a useful guideline. Of course, you can go much deeper into all of this, and there are tons of references out there. Practice is really the key here. Also, this isn't about create pixel level topology. I will show you tips and tricks along the way, but there is no single perfect method. A lot of it is a personal workflow. The most important thing is understanding why you are doing this. Retopology is not for the sake of clean geometry, it's for everything that's come after. Animation, UV unwrapping, texturing, and all the steps that rely on a solid and well thought out topology. So, let's dive into the topology of the face of our friend's coach. I'm going to start with the eye area. I won't worry about the symmetry for now. I'm focusing on the side, and we will mirror everything later. I like to take my time placing the first faces. Also, make sure to activate the retopology shading mode so it's easier to clearly see what you are doing. As I mentioned earlier, I try to keep an even number of faces and respect those midlines. From top to bottom and left to right. So I take a moment to evaluate what I have, placing my center line across the eye area. As you can see, I end up with the same number of faces per quarter, which is great. It makes it much easier to define these main regions and then connect everything afterwards. One important thing, don't try to start in one corner and build everything from there. Take your time, start with a low number of faces, block out the main shapes, and deal with the connection later. Now I'm continuing with the main flows line that starts from the top of the nose, goes around with the cheek, and down to the chin. This is a very important line. I'm not focusing too much on the exact number of faces right now, I'm just trying to place it correctly. I will refine and adjust things as I go. For the lips, for example, I'm using the tool Quad Patch. That allows me to draw lines, subdivide them, and automatically bridge the geometry based on those edges. It's really powerful and super efficient, and I definitely recommend to use it. And as you can see, I'm constantly checking. I have my midline for the mouth and the eyes in place, and from there I can keep building the rest of the topology. Next, I'm taking care of the nose edge loop, bringing it down and connecting it underneath the nose. He has quite a big, long, stylized nose, so it can be a bit trickier, but in the end, it follows the same principle as more realistic human topology. Here, I'm drawing an edge loop using the Quad Patch tool. At this point, I'm also starting to get a sense of how many spans I want around the lips, trying to connect everything carefully. You will notice that the topology flow starts to change around the nose, the lips, and along the main lines from the nose to the cheek and down to the chin. This is where we will soon start dealing with spools. I'm constantly adjusting things, and you will see me redo parts multiple times through the process. That's completely normal. This is just how retopology works. As I connect these three main areas, I'm building the edge loop around the mouth and then moving up towards the eyes. The cheek area needs to connect properly with the eye region, and this is another place where we introduce a pole. As a reminder, a pole is a vertex where 5 edges connect, allowing us to redirect the flow. From there, I focus on creating clean edge loop across all areas, trying to avoid adding unnecessary spans. The goal is to keep the topology as light as possible, while still respecting the shapes of the high poly mesh underneath. Using Shift with the Smooth tool, combined with the face snap, is extremely powerful, almost mandatory, to keep refining and adjusting the topology as you go. Then, with the patch tool, I continue working on the chin and underneath it, drawing edge, connecting, bridging, and smoothing everything. The workflow is really smooth and efficient, thanks to the free add-on, which make the whole process much more enjoyable. And as you can see, we already getting the main part of the face in place pretty quickly. After that, I'm focusing on the lips area. I'm bringing together the upper and the lower parts, making sure to respect the edge loop and keep the same number of spans on both the upper and lower lips. As I mentioned earlier, I'm using the patch tool here and there to help with the connections. One important thing when working with the lips and mouth area during retopology is that you don't want to connect the upper and lower lips directly. We need to leave space for what we call the mouth bag. the inside of the mouth, I will say, where we will later place the teeth, the tongue, and all those internal cavities. The same idea applies to other areas like the nose, the eyes. These internal volumes are important because they help create proper occlusions and give you more realistic results when rendering. Here, I can see there is a bit of mismatch between the upper and the lower parts, so I'm going to fix that by adjusting the edge loop and making sure everything lines up properly. Next up is the nose. I start by handling the nostrils and the cavity. You can see me using the patch tool again to quickly bridge edge loop. When working on this kind of shapes, you might want to get something close to a circular form. It doesn't have to be perfect, but having a good base helps a lot. For that, the Loops tool add-on, it's really useful. It's already available in Blender, you just need to enable it in the preference under extensions, and once activated, you can access it in edit mode with a right click and choose options like circle. You can also tweak the result using the panel in the lower left corner. Here, I'm just in it just to adjust the shape, then rescaling and snapping everything back into the surface. Even if it's not a perfect circle, it gives you a solid starting point for the nostril area. From there, I connect the upper part of the mouth to the side of the nose, extruding faces, and reach the upper part of the nostrils. This area isn't overly complex, it's mostly about connecting the existing piece like the face and the lips. For the shape of the nose, I extrude the geometry quite roughly at first, then add a few edge loops to refine the shape. The key here is to maintain consistent edge flow across the model. It can be tempting to add a lot of loops, but it's always better to keep things as simple and low poly as possible while still capturing the necessary forms. For now, I'm not closing the very tip of the nose. I will handle that later once I have better symmetry in place. I use loop tools again to refine the shapes and smooth things out a bit. At this stage, we have the main critical part of the face in place: the eyes, the mouth, the cheeks, the chin, and the nose. I'm just adding a few extra edge loops where needed, making sure everything aligns well with my symmetry axis and the annotation kit. And with that, we are already in good place to continue. So we can now continue and finish the front face area. At this stage, it's mostly about constant adjustments, moving things around, smoothing, refining, and making sure everything flows nicely. I'm drawing from the jawline and extending that topology up towards the top of the head, then connecting the front parts using those midlines that split the head in half. Around the corner of the eyes, I noticed that it would be beneficial to add an extra edge loop. This gives more room deformations, which is especially important for expressions. So here, I adjust the topology a bit, deleting and merging some vertices to properly insert that new loop. Then, we left with a larger area that's fairly straightforward to handle. From there, I can easily connect and bridge everything to complete the front face topology. So let's finish the head. We leave the ears aside for now, and I got a surprise for you. I've got a specific technique for them, and they will be quite easy to handle later. Let's focus now on the neck and the upper and back parts of the head. For the neck, it's pretty straightforward. I just bridge from the existing jawline under the chin and add a few spans to build it out. To get a better reference, I'm adjusting my symmetry annotation line. I'm drawing by hand here, but you can also use Ctrl plus Shift to get a perfect straight line. Then I just continue extruding faces and edge, connecting everything as I go. You will notice I end up with a few extra spans and some denser edge flows at the back of the head. But that's totally fine. Since we are not directly connecting the head to the body, we have a bit more freedom here. I keep adjusting and smoothing the topology across the area, and then I start looking at the ear region. And I quickly realized I will need more vertices there, so I add some extra edge loop around the corner of the mouth. At this point, I'm not fully noticing it yet, but this can create small issues like triangles forming in that area. And of course, we'll fix that later. That's actually something to be aware of with this add-on. If two vertices are very close, they can sometimes merge automatically, even if you didn't intend to. So just keep an eye on that, as it can lead to a few unexpected results. From this updated topology, I create the first edge loop around the ear area. Then from that loop, I will extrude outward to start building the ear itself. For the ear, I first go into my selection and deactivate the snap tool. At this stage, we are just going to extrude from the edge loop we created and block out the rough shape of the ear. Then afterward, we will project it back into the high poly surface. This is a really efficient technique and we will reuse it later. It's much faster than trying to directly build and connect the edge loop from the head to the ear while snapping the whole time. So here I'm simply extruding, placing, scaling and trying to roughly match the shape of the high poly mesh. It doesn't need to be perfect at this stage, we will refine it later. To help with the adjustment, I use proportional editing, which is extremely useful in this kind of workflow. It lets you move, scale or rotate elements while smoothly affecting the surrounding geometry. The shortcut is O, and you will probably end up using it all the time, especially when working like this, moving your low poly mesh around the high poly surface. Since we are working with an even number of edges in our loops, I can also use the Ctrl plus F and the grid fill option to close gaps cleanly. This avoids creating triangles or unwanted artifacts, which is really helpful for maintaining a clean quad topology. At this point, we have a first worth version of the ear. Next, we will refine and adjust it. So here, I'm creating a seam to help me isolate the ear. This is something I replicate across the whole model later. It's not really for UVs in this case, it's more for selection purpose. During rigging, it allows me to quickly select specific areas and assign skin weight without having to manually reselect everything each time. So I create a seam, then select the ear, create a vertex group, and assign that selection to it using the Assign button. After that, I add a modifier from the Deform category called Shrink Wrap. I will be using this a lot. Here, I set the high resolution head as a target. I assign the vertex group so the modifier only affects the ear area. You can trick the snap mode to adjust how the projection behaves and also play with the offset to slightly inflate or shrink the results. In this case, the results look pretty good. Once I'm happy with it, I usually apply the modifier and continue redefining manually, smoothing and adjusting the vertices of the ear. It takes a bit of time since the ear is a tricky area. This isn't the cleanest possible approach, but it works well enough for what we need here. Then, I delete the center area of the ear to create a clean inner edge loop. This is important because it allows you to define sharper features, almost like creating a bevel. It helps amplify key shapes, like the transition between the inner and outer part of the ear. When using the Smooth tool, you can hold Shift and use the mouse to adjust the brush size and fall off, which is very helpful for fine-tuning. Having a clean, well-placed edge loop around important features is crucial, not just for the ear, but for the entire model. It helps define the shapes more clearly and improves deformation later on. You will see the same principle applied to the other parts of the body. In the end, I close the area using a grid fill. It's not always the ideal solution, especially if you need deformation in that region, but for this case, it works fine. In general though, try to avoid clothing loops like that if you expect complex deformation in that area. So I'm pretty happy with the ear for now. I will come back later to refine some of the edge loop around the corners. At this point, I'm working on the center line of my mesh. The best way to handle this is to select the entire edge loop along the center, then press S to scale, constrain it to the X-axis, and tap 0 on the notepad. This flattens everything perfectly into the straight line. Make sure to deactivate the snap tool before doing this, otherwise you might run into some issues. When that's done, I can add a mirror modifier. It's a good practice to use an empty as a reference object for the mirror. By default, it uses a mesh origin, which can work, but if you ever move or adjust the origin later, it can break your symmetry. Using an empty gives you more control and stability. I notice a small gap along the center line, so I select those vertices and move them toward the middle. With the clamping option enabled in the modifier, the vertices will automatically merge when they meet, which is exactly what we want. Now we are starting to get a clean and fully symmetrical mesh. Having a perfect symmetry is essential for everything that comes next: reveal ripping, rigging, and especially animation. At this point, everything looks good. You can also disable the Retopology shade mode if you want to go back to the standard edit mode display. Once I'm happy with this solid base, I like to duplicate the model and keep a clean backup version that I can go back to at any time. Next, I take a closer look at the mesh. I usually add subdivision modifier and then again use a shrink wrap modifier, targeting the high resolution head. This helps me preview what the final result could look like while closely matching the original high poly shape. At this stage, I'm mostly analyzing, checking if everything holds up, spotting areas that need improvements. I take my time to smooth things out, add or adjust edge loop, and refine the topology where needed. The shrink wrap modifier is really helpful here, as it ensures that I stay faithful to the original script. In this case, since we're working on the stylized character, we have a bit more freedom. We are not relying on the strict backing workflow with normal maps. Instead, we will build a lot of final look directly in texturing, for example using tools like Substance Painter. That said, this shrink wrap approach is especially important if you're working in a backing pipeline where you need to match the high poly as closely as possible. So here, I'm just continuing to refine, adjust and improve the mesh until everything feels clean and consistent. So again, once I'm happy with these parts, I've checked everything, I duplicate the model one more time to keep another clean backup. At this point, I apply the modifier, except for the mirror one. Now, I'm going to dive into some extra cleanup, mainly around the ear, because I'm not really happy with the shape. So I start adjusting the overall edge flow. To better see what I'm doing here, because with transparency and mesh overlap it's not always very clear, you can use the custom object color option and set it to flat black color. You can also disable the specular lighting. This gives you a much cleaner, flat shading view of the retopology mesh, which makes it way easier to read and work on. It took a bit of time to refine the ear and find a cleaner edge loop, figuring out the best way to close everything properly. And in the end, I ended up adding a few extra loops that help connect all the parts more cleanly. But this is also something important to keep in mind. At some point, adding a single edge loop can affect the entire mesh. That's why it's really important to keep things as low as possible, take your time to understand the form, and make decisions that respect the overall structure of your model. So I'm going back to the traditional shading view. I'm happy with the ear after the fixes. Now what I like to do is to make sure everything will behave correctly, without even sticking up bones or skinning it. Is use Sculpt mode in Blender and grab the pose brush. It's this tool here. What is great about it is that you can simply click and hold on an area, then start moving and bending the mesh as if it were IK or FK animation. The size of the brush controls how much the mesh is affected by the deformation. In the tool setting here, you also have different parameters like deformation modes, rotations, origin, pose options, and IK segments, which all change how the manipulation behaves. One thing I noticed is that having a fully closed grid inside the ear can sometimes create stitching issues when you start deforming it. For now, I will leave as it is, because most of the real deformation will happen at the base of the ear anyway. But it's something to keep in mind. Fully closed form like this can become problematic depending on the animation. I keep testing different parts of the mesh with the pose brush, just moving things around and seeing how it reacts. It's actually a really nice way to explore your topology and quickly understand where improvements are needed. Even without bones, this kind of Sculpt mode workflow is really powerful for checking deformation early and getting a better sense of how your model will behave later on. So moving forward, I keep adjusting some vertices and edges as needed. At this stage, it's really all about patience, taking your time and working carefully. Sometimes with this tool, you can accidentally create extra vertices without even noticing. So it's really important to regularly switch to vertex mode, inspect your mesh, and check for any stray or flying vertices. If you find any, just delete them right away. Next, I start creating the inside part of the mesh, beginning with the eye bag. Just like the ear, I make sure to deactivate snapping to keep everything under control. From there, it's mostly about extruding and using the available tools to shape it, building a proper eye socket area that will fully occlude the eye of the character. This is important not just for modeling, but also for lighting and final rendering. It might not look so perfect at this stage, but that's fine. The key here is to take your time. You don't need an overly complex shape here, just some things that properly contain the volume for the eyes, and later for the teeth and tongue as well. And again, once I have this rose shape, I like to jump into Sculpt mode to refine it more easily. It's much faster to adjust the upper and lower eyelids and better match the shape of the eyes using the grab brush. This makes it really easy to push and pull the form until everything feels right. Alright, the eye bag is now done. Next up is the mouth bag. So I select the inside of the mouth area and start extruding to build the shape I want. It's very similar to working with vertices, just pushing and shaping the inner part of the mesh so it sits properly inside, especially in preparation for a final mirror pass later. When you're working on these inner areas, it can sometimes get a bit annoying or hard to navigate because everything is so enclosed. That's where the shortcut Alt+B is really useful. It lets you isolate a portion of the mesh so you can focus on just that area without needing to delete or hide things manually. Alt+B makes it much easier to work on specific sections, and you can comfortably switch between perspective and orthographic views while doing so. So I start with a rough placement first, just blocking in the form. Later on, I'll come back to refine it, add extra edge loops, and properly shape the interior. This will also give us space for the teeth and tongue, making sure everything is properly encapsulated inside the mouth cavity. We'll come back to the mouth bag afterward, but for now, I'm starting to define some additional seams. This is mainly to help with selection and to make the rigging process easier later on. As I mentioned before, this isn't for UVs, it's really just for workflow and selection purposes. At this point, I'm adjusting the ear again and I start laying out some seams. While doing this, I notice that I'm missing a clean edge loop around the outer corner of the ear. This is exactly why it's important to regularly check your seams. You can quickly spot when something feels off or incomplete. So I go back in, adjust the edge loop and move some vertices and edges around until I get a proper clean loop around the ear. I'm basically jumping back and forth here, just refining the shape until everything feels consistent and well supported. So back to the mouth again. This is where I noticed an issue at the corner of the mouth. It's not really a big problem, but more of a tool behavior issue. When you have two vertices that are very close to each other and you add an edge loop, it can sometimes merge those vertices and end up creating triangles. So I need to fix that because we really don't want triangles in this area. Otherwise, the deformation will look pretty bad later on. So I go in and clean up that section again, making sure the topology stays nice and even. So I'm just taking care of the mouth bag and the outer part of the mouth, making sure I get matching and properly connected edges. Take your time with this process. If you think it through step by step, you'll end up with a clean and solid topology in the end. I also keep smoothing things out to improve the edge flow, and I regularly check the loops by holding Ctrl to inspect how everything is flowing. At this point, I'm starting to get good results. But when I add the subdivision modifier, I can see the mouth starting to open up. That happens because we're missing supporting edge loops that hold the shape. So this is where I need to go back in and add extra edge loops to properly maintain the form and better respect the high resolution sculpts. So I'm checking the middle symmetry line and I notice that some of the inner nose geometry is slightly popping out of the center line. So I just bring those vertices back in, making sure everything stays properly aligned on the symmetry axis. At the same time, I start adding some seams as well, mainly for selection purposes. We're working around the nose and the eyes here, And when you press L to select linked geometry and choose seams, you can clearly see the result of how cleanly everything is separated. I continue placing additional seams, always making sure the mirror line stays accurate and everything is properly aligned with the mirror modifier. And again, I don't hesitate to jump into sculpt mode when needed to quickly adjust the shape. I really like using it for that. Being able to push and pull the form on the fly without heavy setup or delays. Everything feels very responsive overall. And I didn't experience any crashes during the entire retopology process, which is honestly really nice and makes the workflow very smooth. Moving forward again, I notice a small hiccup on the edge loop around the mouth. There's a nasty triangle that I want to get rid of. So I clean that up, then continue adjusting and smoothing things out, moving some vertices and refining the edge flow. I also start adding extra edge loops to better define the lips and help build a proper closed mouth shape, along with cleaner loops around the eyes and lip area. By using the seams I created earlier, I can easily select the relevant parts and make adjustments more efficiently. I slightly scale things down along one axis and reposition the geometry to get a cleaner, more controlled lip closure. Using masking in sculpt mode also helps a lot in this process. I apply the same approach around the eyes as well, to refine the corners of the eyelids and improve the overall shape. Now I'm finalizing some seams and adding the median parts we talked about earlier in the process. This is mainly to improve selection later on and make the rigging workflow easier. It also helps when it comes to skinning, since separating the upper and lower parts makes things much cleaner to manage. I also add another seam edge loop around the eyes, making sure I can quickly and easily select the thickness of the inner eye loop, as well as the surrounding area behind it. This just helps keep everything organized and much more controllable for the next stages of the pipeline. And thanks to these seams, you can quickly test things by selecting different parts, playing around with the mesh, and using the proportional editing tool to see how everything behaves under rough manipulation. And here we are with the final head retopology. Clean, readable, and ready for animation. It was a fairly quick process in the end. Of course, it takes a lot of patience and practice, but when you take the time to analyze everything upstream, like the adjustments we made earlier, you can really see how your initial decisions translate into the final results. That's really the goal here, to demystify retopology. It's often described as a painful step, and it can be, but when you slow down, analyze, and actually enjoy the process, it becomes much more manageable and even enjoyable. And in the end, it's such an important foundation for everything that comes after in character creation. If you really take the time to understand each step, you set yourself up for a much stronger result overall. Next up, once the head is done, we can move on to the body. We'll start with the upper body, beginning with the t-shirt. It's the same process as before with the face. It takes time and it helps to take notes and plan things out as you go. What I like to do at this stage is always draw a symmetry line on the model first, then start analyzing the main edge flow I want to build into the mesh. This helps define the structure early on. We're going to place main edge loops around key areas like the neck, the arms and the torso. You can keep it simple and stick to clean, straightforward edge loops like I'm doing here. Or depending on your character, like in this case, since it's a more athletic, sporty body, you can start adapting the topology to follow the larger muscle groups and overall anatomy more closely. So instead of using straight lines around the arm and the torso, we're going to try to respect a bit more the pectoral area we have here. Even with low poly, we can still maintain the shape of the muscular zones without going too complex or too detailed. We can still get something really interesting, especially around the shoulder area here. You can try to create edge loops that follow the form and help preserve the silhouette, always keeping the main goal in mind, maintaining clean shapes. So, that's my first thought process. I think I'll also add some midlines around these areas so we can split the mesh into different sections. And once everything is set up properly, we'll be good to go and start the retopology. So again, let's create a quick plane, delete the face, and make sure snapping is enabled. Then I jump into the add-on tool and start building out quads. I begin with the neck area around the corner, always paying attention to the number of edges I want and keeping everything consistent from the start. Then I move on to the next big area. As I mentioned before, it's important to keep things low, start with the main forms you want to focus on first, and then connect everything afterward. From there, I continue into the pectoral area, then shift the edge flow to start building the dorsal area, establishing a clean loop direction here. There are multiple ways to approach this. You could do it like we did with the ear, but you quickly notice that this can introduce limitations when it comes to deformation. Using a grid fill in this area might not be ideal if you want stronger or more extreme deformation later on. Since we're working on a stylized character, we actually need that flexibility. So a more controlled and simpler topology approach is better. Something that connects cleanly and supports deformation properly. So instead, I add a few guiding edge loops, then change direction to create a nice flow both vertically and horizontally. From there, I continue drawing and connecting quads through the lower and mid sections. And then we can connect the upper parts with the lower end, including the arm and the collar area. So here I'm adding extra edge loops to help maintain the shape around the pectoral region. Then I connect everything together and smooth out the different parts to get a cleaner transition. For the rest of the shoulder, I'm going to use the same method I used for the ear. That means I deactivate snapping, create a more spherical edge loop, and then extrude and roughly place everything into position like I'm doing here. Once that base is in place, I use a shrink wrap modifier to match the exact shape of the high resolution mesh. From there, it's all about refinement, adjusting vertices, smoothing, and repositioning elements where needed. I rely on the smooth tool, but not only that. I also do a lot of manual adjustments, because sometimes you really need to take control and refine the overall mesh to get a clean and balanced result. Continuing to check the overall mesh, I start adding extra edge loops. The same will apply for the arm later on. You'll see it's really important to keep adding loops where needed. You can stick to a simple approach here. You can go more complex with the topology when you have additional constraints, but the basic principle is always the same. The more an area bends, especially when it goes beyond 40 degrees or more, the more supporting edge loops you need. This ensures proper deformation on both the inner and outer parts of the mesh. Then I smooth things out again, checking the normals and the overall look of the low poly. I also use the subdivision modifier to evaluate how everything holds up. As you can see, the shape of the dorsal and pectoral area is being nicely preserved, which means the topology is starting to behave correctly. Next up is the axis of symmetry. So I follow the same process. I select the edge loop on both the front and back parts and scale it on the x-axis to 0. Then I add the mirror modifier and make sure clipping is enabled, bringing the edges close together at the center so they properly merge. I also make sure to apply the transforms so I have clean and correct rotation, scale, and location values. You can do this at the end as well, but sometimes it can lead to messy results if it's not handled properly early on. Finally, I add a few extra edge loops for the inner parts of the mesh to create thickness. I start with the sleeves, then the neck, and I also apply the same approach on the bottom part of the t-shirt. Later on, we'll connect everything properly, so I may still adjust a few things. And here we are, starting to get a nice looking model. And to finalize this part, I'm just going to add some seams and make sure everything is in order. I've got a nice clean middle line here, and I can also create additional seams for both the outer and inner parts to make selection easier later on. And here's the final result of this upper body section, which is really solid. It was a bit easier compared to the head, of course, since we don't have a connection between multiple complex areas yet. But that's perfectly fine. It's really satisfying to see the final result of this pass on our character. And that wraps up this step of the workflow. So now, let's handle the arm. The arm itself is actually fairly simple. The main shape is basically a cylinder with some adjustments along the upper and lower parts to match the anatomy. But the hand is of course the trickiest part. You have more complex shapes here. 5 fingers, proper edge loops, and everything needs to flow correctly from the fingers into the palm and down into the wrist. That's where things get more challenging. There are actually a lot of different ways to approach this. In this case, we're going to build it from scratch in this video. But you can also rely on existing resources. For example, there are asset bundles available on the Blender website where you can download ready-made base meshes for free. It's very quick to access and integrate into your project. You'll find different types of meshes there. Everything from full base characters with skeletons to stylized or realistic models, and also individual parts like faces, feet, and hands. At some point, it can make a lot of sense to reuse a pre-made hand mesh. Then simply append it into your project and connect it to your wrist. There's no shame in using external resources like this. It can save a lot of time and help you focus on the parts that really matter. In my case, I'll also be using separate teeth and tongue models later on, since those are often painful to build from scratch. Using well-made assets for those parts is completely fine and can really speed up the workflow. So my method for building the hand isn't to go into traditional face mode with snapping and start building quads one by one. I prefer to start from a primitive and work from there. More like a sculpting approach, the hand can first be simplified into a cube with 3 edge loops inside, and then 2 additional edge loops on the sides. From this cube, we are going to define the fingers. What I do next is inset the faces like I've drawn here in my sketch, and these inset areas will become the base for the fingers. From this very rough low poly blockout, we can already apply a simple subdivision modifier and get a surprisingly solid foundation for the hand. It's a very simple, straightforward and powerful method, and I highly recommend it for retopology or hand creation in general. So I start by creating a cube and placing it roughly around the hand area. Then I add extra edge loops to define where the fingers will go, and I slightly adjust the overall shape of the cube to get something more like a trapezoid. I use the edge slide tool to reposition some edges without breaking the form too much. Then I define the main finger sections by using Ctrl+I to inset the faces. In the tool settings at the bottom left, I switch to individual mode so each face gets its own inset. From there, I scale and adjust everything into a more finger-like layout. I do the same for the thumb. Next, I select the faces again and use Alt+C to extrude along normals. This gives a very rough first version of the fingers, but you can already see the hand taking shape. After that, I refine the form by staying in this low poly state, adjusting finger placements, aligning everything back to the original mesh, and tweaking the inset positions at the base of each finger. The proportional editing tool is very useful here to avoid breaking the overall structure. Then I add a midline edge loop to support the hand's overall structure. Even with this rough base, if I apply a subdivision modifier, you can already see a clean and readable hand starting to form. From there, it's just a matter of adding the minimum necessary supporting edge loops. Not too many, but enough so that when you subdivide once, you still have a solid low poly foundation to build from. I delete the back face of the wrist and I slightly adjust the top of the fingers to refine the silhouette. And then I create and apply the subdivision modifier we talked about earlier. At this stage, we can already see that we have a really nice base structure. The next step is to project everything onto our high resolution mesh. I use the shrink wrap modifier again, and as you can see, it fits quite well. There are a few small distortions around the areas between the fingers, but that's expected and totally fine at this stage. After testing the modifier a bit, I decide to apply it and jump back into edit mode with my Retopology setup, making sure face snapping is enabled. From there, I start smoothing everything out. The mesh naturally snaps back onto the high poly surface, which helps me quickly recover the correct form and get the topology exactly where I want it. This method really shows how efficient hand creation can be with this workflow. Next, I spend some time refining things, adjusting, smoothing, and repositioning edge loops until everything feels clean and well structured. Then I start adding extra edge loops on the fingers. I select the areas I want to improve, and using Ctrl+B, I create bevels with a segment count of 2. This allows me to quickly generate supporting loops exactly where I need them, without having to manually build everything. I do the same for the thumb as well. And here we have the final hands, clean, well structured, and ready to be used in our low poly character. So the next part is really simple. I deactivate the snap face method and make sure to properly scale and align the wrist. Then I extrude the entire arm, adding a few extra edge loops in between to help match the overall shape. Later on, I use the same workflow we've been using from the beginning, the shrink wrap modifier. I create an additional vertex group just to isolate the arm, so I can assign those vertices to the shrink wrap modifier specifically. From there, I adjust the starting area of the arm, then add more edge loops, mainly around the wrist, and the transition between the upper and lower arm, especially at the elbow. This gives me all the support loops I need for proper deformation. I also add a bit of inset geometry at the end of the arm, just to clean up the termination and avoid having a rough or unfinished edge. And there we are, an arm with a nice hand, clean topology and solid deformation potential, all without spending too much time on it. Simple, efficient and effective. And in order to finalize these parts, I'm adding some seams again to make selection easier later on, around the wrist, splitting the arm in half, around the elbow, and also on the fingers. Alright, we've now got the head, t-shirt and arms with hands ready to be rigged. The topology is clean and everything is in place. We can now move on to the lower part of the mesh, the legs and the shoes. So what I'm going to do here is keep everything as one single piece for this entire area, meaning the pelvis, legs and shoes. Since it's a fairly tight cloth, it makes sense to keep a more uniform structure. We already have separated parts for the head and arms, which makes topology easier to manage, even if it can be a bit more challenging later for skinning and rigging. So now the question is how we handle the connection between these main sections. I start by analyzing the number of edge loops I have at the bottom of the t-shirt. I can see there are 24 edges in total, which means 12 edges on one side. So I'm going to stick with that same count and use it as a base for the lower part of the mesh, making sure everything stays consistent as I build the legs and remaining geometry. So let's focus on the pants. Same process as usual. We start from a plane and use our PolyQuilt tool. First, I set up a simple construction with the symmetry axis. Nothing too complex here, just making sure I stay consistent with the structure. The main goal is to keep those 12 edges on this section, so I can properly match the connection between the torso and the legs. From there, I start adding edge loops around the leg connection. On the front, I currently have this connection here, but I'll probably adjust it later because I don't really like having a large pole right on the front of the character. Nothing special otherwise, just keeping it clean and straightforward. The important part is maintaining proper edge loops and respecting that count of 12, so everything connects properly. Next, I'll take the edge count we have around the leg area, and we're starting to get a solid base for our pants. And now for the legs, same process as the arms. I start extruding and roughly placing the leg shape. This time I'm doing it step by step, extruding down toward the ankle. I adjust the rotations as I go, making sure everything follows the overall silhouette. For the foot, I'm just adding a few extra edge loops to define the separation between the leg and the boot. Even if you're using the shrink wrap modifier later, it's important to already respect the shape of the high poly mesh as much as possible, because it will make the next steps much easier. Once everything is roughly in place, I can add the shrink wrap modifier. As you saw earlier, I also created a vertex group so I can control exactly which area is affected, without influencing the rest of the mesh. It's a really fast and effective workflow, and it gives clean results quite quickly, which makes the process very enjoyable. After this first pass with the modifier, I apply it, then refine the mesh by adding edge loops, smoothing and adjusting the overall leg topology. So it takes a bit of time to smooth everything out and get a clean, consistent flow across the edge loops. I'm also adding extra loops around the ankle area, because that's where we can expect a lot of deformation. It took me a bit of time to polish the foot as well, because even with snapping and smoothing, it wasn't really picking up the shape correctly, so I had to manually readjust it. I keep switching between edit mode and sculpt mode to refine the shape and better match the silhouette I want. again. Using Ctrl+B helps me isolate parts of the mesh and get the view I need. It's also really useful to end up with clean, almost perfectly horizontal edge loops, which is important for rigging later on. At that point, I don't hesitate to select loops individually or even all at once and make sure I use the correct pivot point, like the individual origins option in the top UI. Then I can use S, Z, 0 to flatten and align the vertices. After that, I refine the tip of the foot and start adding the extra edge loops for the boots. Just a tight bevel and some slight outward scaling to define the start of the shoe. I also add more loops in areas with heavy deformation, especially around the knee and curved sections. I might have added a bit too many there, so I'll adjust that later. Then I fine-tune the connection between the pants and the legs. I adjust the symmetry axis to match the pants, add a mirror modifier, and enable clipping. After that, I remove a few unnecessary edge loops around the knee area, since it was getting a bit too dense. With smooth shading, it becomes much easier to see where the topology is too heavy. And at this point, it's really starting to come together nicely. So now I'm connecting the torso with the legs, which means I can remove the inner faces I created earlier. This step is fairly straightforward. I simply align the lower edge loops of the pants with the upper part of the torso. First, I slightly adjust the first edge loop of the pants to make the connection cleaner. Then, in object mode, I select both parts and use Ctrl+J to join them into a single mesh. Now, back in edit mode, everything is combined into one object instead of two separate pieces. From there, it's just a matter of merging the vertices. The snapping tool is really useful here. Not only does it snap points together, but it also merges them automatically, which makes the process really efficient. As you can see, connecting the two parts is actually quite simple. Next, I smooth and refine everything, making sure the transition between torso and pants flows nicely. I also add an extra supporting edge loop to ensure clean deformation once everything is smoothed. And there we go. Really clean and solid results. At this point, it almost reminds me of Mr. Incredible. Same kind of strong, blocky anatomy, right? We're almost done, and as I mentioned earlier, I didn't like that big pole in the front of the pants area. So I'm creating an additional edge flow here and inserting another quad to redirect the topology, making sure the pole isn't sitting right on the center line anymore. Next up is just cleaning and smoothing different areas, making sure everything is properly aligned and in place. I also add seams around the upper part of the leg, the pants, the shoes, and along the sides of the boots. For the back of the boots, I'll add an extra seam as well, which will likely help later during UV unwrapping. I make sure the symmetry axis is properly set and everything is nicely balanced. And there we go! We now have a final model, fully retopologized in Blender from a high poly sculpt down to a clean animation ready mesh. And honestly, it's really great to be able to do the entire process inside Blender without relying on any other DSCC tools. We can still tweak a few edge loops here and there, but overall this is a really solid base mesh, clean, optimized and ready to be rigged and animated. Before wrapping up, I just want to show the last part, the cap. At this point, now that you understand the method, it becomes really straightforward. I simply replicate the same workflow, starting with basic topology, adding some guiding annotations, and then building clean edge loops around the main areas and the tip of the cap. Nothing fancy here, nothing complex, just taking the time to think about edge flow placement, especially where it will help later for rigging, UVs and texturing. After spending a bit of time refining this small piece, everything is now complete for the accessories as well. You can continue the same approach for the rest, like the whistle. For the neck strap, I simply use the curve, and for the whistle itself, it's just a basic primitive shape that gets refined slightly. And there you have it, our final mesh, fully retopologized and ready to be rigged and animated. Thanks for watching, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video and I see you in 2 weeks for a new one. Ciao!